Well, hey everybody, this is Joe Van Cleve. Good day. I'm kind of want to talk about images and visualizing images in the world and viewfinders and frame viewers. I know that sounds kind of cryptic. Stay tuned. It was a number of years ago, probably 5 to 7 years ago, I made a little pretend camera out of a block of wood, block of pine, and sanded it, and I spray painted it black, and I had this old Polaroid Model 600 camera, kind of a junk camera from a thrift store, and I kind of tore it apart and took some of the parts out, and I stuck the lens on the front, put like different parts on it, like knobs, and just to make it look like kind of a pretend camera. And my young grandson at the time, he was probably 3 or 4 years old, he saw that and really enjoyed using it, and somewhere in my files I have a photograph of him holding it up, pretending like he's taking a picture. I think I had a little square viewfinder, like the optical finder that was on top of the Polaroid camera, just a little tube. I had that stuck on top, and he was just frame viewing these mental images. And I got to talking with him about the idea of visualization and art, trying to keep it on a child's level. But afterwards, after our discussion, I really started thinking more deeply about the importance of pre-visualizing. And I'm sure this goes back hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. This little viewfinder, little tunnel, kind of a frame viewer, I kind of got interested in that. Because when you're a photographer and you walk out in the world with a camera and you use the viewfinder of the camera to visualize potential images, you don't realize at the time, but you're using a frame viewer of some kind. It becomes a frame viewer system, and you're really thinking mostly about the camera itself and about your exposure and all that. But I think it's real important, the whole idea of frame viewing. So I went off on this tangent back then. I wrote a blog article, a couple blog articles about it years ago. In the course of this, I made this little thing. This is made out of something like 1/8-inch thick model aircraft plywood. And on the front, I painted it white, and I designed this little logo, which was kind of like a camera obscura eyeball, light coming into a box camera from a pinhole. I made it a 3:4 aspect ratio image. On the back side, the side facing me, I painted it black, and then I put a little device on the thing. And so this is a clicker, and what the clicker does is, my intention with this was I was going to go out with this device and I'm going to take mental photographs. At the time I called it photography, F-A-U-X, photography. I know this is kind of a conceptual, weird, artsy thing, but my whole idea was to try to spur on my creativity, my ability to see potential subject matter and compositions out in the world. And when you're selecting a moment in space-time, you're selecting a three-dimensional spatial viewpoint, and then you're selecting a moment in time, and that clicker is the fourth dimension. That in your mind, you hear the click, and the idea is whatever it looks like through the viewfinder, that audible click is going to help you. In theory, it's going to help you to remember what that looked like. It's kind of an audible signal that signals your brain, make a mental image of what you saw through the viewfinder. I actually did a few sessions out in public, out on the streets with this device. My experiment was to make 10 mental images, and I thought of this in terms of photography, like I was taking photographs wirelessly into my brain from this device, and every time the click happens, whatever I saw in the frame, I would try to remember. I would try to exercise my visual memory. So I do 10 shots within a pretty close period of time, and then I go somewhere to reflect, like a coffee shop or a cafe, and I would sit down and I would take out a little notebook and I would try to write down the 10 images and try to describe them verbally, what it was, and maybe even draw a little rectangle and kind of draw a simple line drawing of whatever the scene was, just as a way of practicing the visual memorization and then the visual recall later, kind of a memory enhancement trick. So this little frame viewer, this photography, I thought was pretty interesting. Having said all that, so I was in the process of reading some of my favorite websites, and I was reading Austin Kleon's blog. And if you don't know Austin Kleon, he's the guy that wrote the book Steal Like an Artist. And he had this article about where he mentions Sister Corita Kent. Now, Sister Corita Kent was a nun, and she was a teacher, and she was an artist. And she kind of got discovered late in life for her artwork, but I think her more profound work was as a teacher, an art teacher for children and kids of all ages. And she has this quote from the Balinese culture: "We have no art. Everything we do is as good as we can." And what she meant by that, and what they meant by that, is there's no class distinction between a professional or an academic art world and what people do in everyday life. We should make everyday life as if we were artists doing everything, scrubbing the toilet as an artist, whatever it is, right? But one of the things that she used, apparently, as a crucial tool to helping their students visualize the world and understand the way images are used, is a finder. And what she describes as a finder is a little piece of cardboard with a small hole in it. Now, she says in one of the documentary videos I've seen, she says the hole should not be any bigger than an inch. But I just happened to come across this today in my bookshelf, and I realized, hey, that's a square format finder. And she calls these finders, and what she would do with it is she would instruct her students to go out into public, into the streets, and use the finders to isolate individual objects and to compose in the finder. Like, I'm composing this coffee cup right now, and I get a really interesting balance of compositions if I position the finder just a certain way to get a certain amount of space around that cup. And what she said is a finder permits the close study of objects by isolating them from their surroundings, which enables consideration of their aesthetic value. So in other words, when we look at scenes out in public or whatever, we tend to take in the whole, and maybe we look upon the overall thing in a kind of a group context, but aesthetically studying and enjoying individual objects for what they are, that's what the finder is for. So you need something big enough to obscure the central part of the field of view that has the fine detail. So it has to be that big. And then the window has to be small enough so that you can isolate individual objects. So obviously, if the window's too big, like my example of the photography frame viewer, it's probably too big of a window in too small of a piece of board, because it makes a border all right, but I can still see too much around it. Whereas her finder is big enough to isolate, so you just see this background, isolating the foreground, and then you have this little window where you see the world, and you can select individual things to look at. So it's really easy. So I was just going through my bookshelf where I have all this spare cardboard, and I came across this piece of cardboard. I'm not even sure what it's from. So I'm going to try to cut roughly an inch size hole in this. And now I was thinking about what would be the right aspect ratio for this. I really like square format, which goes back to the medium format camera. So there's really a certain balance to the square format that kind of reminds me visually of the circle. Like the original Kodak Brownie box cameras had circular images, which is really cool. You could even do a circular hole if you wanted to do that. But the problem with rectangular images, you get to the problem of aspect ratio. There's a lot of different ways to do this aspect ratio selection, but I think a square format is a pretty good idea to start with. So I'm going to probably just make a little smaller viewfinder here, a finder in the spirit of Sister Corita, and see if I can go out and have fun with capturing mental photographs. like that. Kind of like that. Here's another view I really like. Nicely balanced. Here is a nice composition of the tree trunks, tree branches. I like this view. Now obviously, when you're doing this without a camera, you're going to see the edge of the cardboard opening sharper. This looks very fuzzy opening just because of the depth of field of the lens. But I like that chair isolated like that. I like this tree trunk and the shadows of the tree branches projected behind it. And you know, I was talking about in the context of still photography, but I really like the motion of the shadows of the leaves as a video effect. It's very cool. I think there's a symbiotic relationship between readers and writers and viewers and artists. It helps to know a little bit about writing in order to be a reader, and it helps to know a little bit about art in order to appreciate the work of artists. Being creatively literate enables us to more deeply understand the work of other creatives. It really helps us to become more visually literate, and thereby we can appreciate the work of other visual artists. Every time I've gone out and actually used a finder device like Sister Corita's idea or my photography frame viewer, I've always been amazed by how much it actually works. Being able to visually isolate the subjects in the vast surroundings of our landscape and isolating individual views is so powerful. I have this interesting observation, though, is whenever I've gone out into the public arena to a purposefully scenic area suitable for photography, typically like street photography, some public venue in the city, I always come away with the idea that it's wasted time using one of these because I could have taken a real camera and captured photographs in a more mechanical way. But later I end up with kind of a guilty feeling that, hey, you blew the opportunity to bring this out, almost as if I don't really believe that there's any validity to the mental photographs that you collect. But it really is an exercise, I think. It's an exercise that builds, it expands your creative potential, your ability to visualize, isolate settings, scenes, vistas, and views from the larger context around us. And so I'm indebted to people like Sister Corita for having discovered that, rediscovered that, and shared it with a lot of people. And that's what I'm doing right here. I'm hoping you guys will consider, if you're interested at all in visual art and visual creativity and growing your ability to see visually, build yourself a finder, a little inch-size hole in a piece of cardstock, and go out in the world and find those unique vantage points and record them in the wet matter up here. This is Joanne Cleve. Have yourselves a great day.